The political fate of Boris Johnson is tonight hanging in the balance after he faced a lengthy grilling by senior MPs. The former Prime Minister is being investigated over a possible contempt of Parliament, something that, if proved, could ultimately lead to him having to resign as an MP. But Mr Johnson today swore that he did not lie to the House of Commons, and he said his statements about Partygate were what he honestly knew and believed at the time. In sometimes testy exchanges, at one point he even turned fire on the Privileges Committee himself, accusing them of being investigator, prosecutor, judge and jury. Well, the hearing wrapped up in the last hour. In just a moment, we'll get a reaction and analysis. But first, with the committee's forensic examination, here's our Deputy Political Editor, Anushka Astana.
Why did you lie to Parliament?
Or did he lie? That was the question facing Boris Johnson today as he headed towards Parliament for an hours-long grilling by MPs. A grilling that began with an oath.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give for this committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Addressing MPs who are investigating whether he misled Parliament when he said there were no parties, guidance had always been followed, Mr Johnson began.
I am here to say to you, hand on heart, that I did not lie to the House. When those statements were made, they were made in good faith and on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time.
He urged the 7 members of Parliament's Privileges Committee not to trust his former chief aide, Dominic Cummings.
He has every motive to lie.
And then turned to the first part of his defence, focusing on the layout of number 10 Downing Street.
It's a cramped, narrow 18th century townhouse. We had no choice but to meet day in, day out, 7 days a week in an unrelenting battle against COVID. I had to call many meetings on the spot and to call make a great many high-speed decisions.
But was he really making high-speed decisions in this first image pulled up by the committee? Was this leaving drink for then Director of Communications Lee Kane really necessary?
2 senior officials, senior advisors in government had left their jobs in very, very difficult and challenging circumstances. And it was necessary to steady the ship. It was necessary to show that there was no rancour, that the business of the government was being carried on.
Mr Johnson argued that social distancing was maintained to the best of their ability.
You can't expect human beings in an environment like number 10 to have, as it were, a invisible electrified fence around them. They will occasionally drift into each other's orbit.
The comment angered Bereaved Families, and there was plenty of scepticism from this committee as well.
But I don't think we agree with your interpretation of the guidance.
There's a gathering taking place with between 25 and 40 people. You had clear direct line of sight.
Why didn't you correct the record then? Because that would have been an obvious thing to do.
She was not asking whether you organised the trestle tables with the alcohol on it. She was asking whether you saw the trestle tables with the alcohol
I did see. I don't remember what exactly was on the trestle tables. I know that people around the country will look at those events and think they look like the very kind of events that we, or I, were forbidding to everyone else. But I will believe till the day I die that it was my job to thank staff for what they had done.
And there was this repeated gripe.
People who say that we were partying in lockdown simply do not know what they are talking about.
Mr Johnson, who occasionally consulted the lawyers flanking him, had another defence, that he had been assured the gatherings had not broken the rules.
Who were the officials who gave these assurances?
Well, I can't name these
Name
officials.
me one.
I don't know if I can.
And then another question from another Conservative that led to some anger.
Perhaps
I put it to you, Mr Johnson, you did not take proper advice.
I did say, this is complete nonsense. I mean, complete nonsense. I asked the relevant people. They were senior people. They'd been working very hard.
And back he came to that key defence that to him, the Downing Street gatherings were not parties. But they did force Boris Johnson out of this building. What will they now mean for the rest of his political career? Anushka Astana, ITV News.
Well, as Anushka set out there, the first question for the Privileges Committee is whether or not Boris Johnson did mislead Parliament. In his evidence, he accepts that he did, but he insists it was unintentional and therefore not so-called contempt. So the committee now has to decide whether it agrees whether the Commons was recklessly or intentionally misled by Mr Johnson. If so, it may recommend a punishment. Things like a written apology, a docking of his salary, or even a suspension from the Commons. Now, the most serious would be suspending him for 10 days or more. That would trigger a recall petition whereby Mr Johnson's constituents can demand a by-election for his seat. But, crucially, any punishment must first be approved by MPs voting in the Commons. OK, so our UK editor Paul Brand, whose reports, of course, helped expose the Partygate scandal, is here. And some of ITV's evidence was used today, wasn't it? What did you make of Mr Johnson's responses?
Well, Mary, there were 3 hours of evidence, which I think we can boil down to 3 key points, which will help the committee to reach its conclusions. The first is this one about social distancing. There was so much talk in the committee today about social distancing, because if you take a look at this photograph, for example, of the Prime Minister's birthday party, well, he was asked how could he survey that scene and think that that was within the rules, that was within the guidance. Or if you take a look at this one, for example, of the leaving party for his aide, Lee Kane, again, how was that within the guidance, the social distancing guidance? Because they were crammed in together around that table full of alcohol. He said eventually that, yes, OK, social distancing was, in his words, imperfect in number 10. So he was asked, OK, if you couldn't properly social distance, why didn't you have screens between you? He said, well, they just weren't in that photograph. They were in a different room. I don't think the committee found that part of his evidence particularly credible. Moving on to one of the key quotes that's been used in much of the media after it was broadcast on ITV News, where Boris Johnson said this at one event, allegedly, that this was probably the most unsocially distanced gathering in the UK right now. Now, today he was asked, did you say that? He said, I can't remember. He couldn't guarantee that he hadn't said it, but he said it wasn't likely. Again, I don't think the committee found that particularly credible. And then lastly, there was the issue of, as you've just been hearing from Anushka, about his advisors. What were they telling him? What kind of advice was he falling back on? Now, at this point, he was pointed to a WhatsApp message from his head of communications, Jack Doyle, which said, I'm struggling to come up with a way that this one is within the rules. That didn't actually go to Boris Johnson. He said he never got that message. But he said other advisors did assure him that all the guidance was adhered to at all times. So he was asked who, and he couldn't tell them who. He said there was one female member of staff, but he couldn't name her. She wanted to remain anonymous. All in all, it made for a pretty extraordinary 3 hours. By the end of it, Boris Johnson looked pretty flustered, the committee pretty frustrated.
OK, interesting stuff, isn't it, Paul? Thank you.